Deep in the mountains, where human feet rarely tread, stood an ancient monastery, forgotten by time and people. The old building, once a haven for monks, had become ruins hidden from view by a dense forest. The locals avoided these places, speaking of terrible legends passed down from generation to generation. I, Dmitri, had always been a skeptic. I was not frightened by ancient tales and the stories of old men who often exaggerated reality. But one day, while reading through old archives in the city library, I came across a mention of this monastery and its mysterious disappearances. This piqued my interest, and I decided to search for the truth. I meticulously prepared for the expedition. I gathered maps, necessary tools, flashlights, and food. My companion was my old friend Alexander, who, like me, was fascinated by the mysteries of the past. We decided to set out in the fall when the forest seemed to be falling into a deep sleep, and nature around us was filled with a gloomy atmosphere. Our journey began in a small village at the foot of the mountains. The locals, upon hearing about our goal, shook their heads and warned us of the dangers ahead. One of the village elders, a frail old man with deep wrinkles, even tried to persuade us to abandon this venture. But our minds were already made up, and we were not going to back down. The first few days of our trek went according to plan. We navigated through dense forests, climbed steep slopes, and camped overnight in tents. The nature around us was majestic but simultaneously frightening: tall pines, rocky gorges, and a sky increasingly covered by heavy clouds. On the third day, we reached a plateau from which we could see the abandoned monastery. Its crumbling towers barely peeked through the mist, surrounded by ancient walls that could no longer stand against time. We stood at the edge of the forest, silently gazing at the sight, realizing that we would soon cross the threshold into the unknown. As we approached, we found that the road to the monastery had overgrown with bushes and trees. The path was difficult, but nothing could stop us. Soon we entered the monastery grounds, where absolute silence reigned. Only the occasional rustle of the forest broke this peace, filling our hearts with unease. The monastery turned out to be even more sinister than I could have imagined. The ruined buildings, collapsed roofs, and ancient statues covered in moss and mold gave this place an otherworldly feeling. We circled the inner courtyard and entered the main building, where, according to legend, ancient manuscripts and artifacts were kept. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had entered for hundreds of years. The ceiling barely held together, and we had to move cautiously to avoid causing a collapse. On the walls hung old icons, their images almost erased by time. We headed toward the central part of the monastery, where a large hall was located. As we entered, we were engulfed by a strange atmosphere. In the center of the hall stood a massive stone altar, which seemed to be the focal point of this place. Above the altar loomed an ancient fresco depicting a battle between angels and demons. At first glance, there was nothing unusual, but the longer I studied the details, the more I realized something was wrong. We approached the altar and noticed it was covered with a thin layer of black substance, resembling dried blood. Scattered around it were remnants of what seemed to be ritual items. Alexander began to examine the altar, and at that moment, we heard a strange noise. It was quiet, barely noticeable, but with each moment, it grew louder. The sound came from beneath the altar. We began to search for a way to open it, and finally found a small hidden mechanism. When we activated it, the altar began to slowly move, revealing a passageway below. A cold draft emanated from the passage, and we smelled mold and decay. We descended an old staircase leading to the monastery's underground. Here, absolute darkness reigned, and only our flashlights cut through it. The underground was vast, long corridors, old doors leading to the unknown, and stone walls marked with strange symbols. We started exploring this place, trying not to get lost in the maze of tunnels. Several hours passed when we stumbled upon an old library. Here, among dusty shelves, ancient manuscripts bound in leather and adorned with strange symbols were stored. These books seemed to contain knowledge long lost to humanity. We began studying them, hoping to find answers to our questions. But the more we read, the stronger the feeling grew that someone was watching us. From time to time, we heard rustling and footsteps echoing through the depths of the dungeons. I began to notice that the shadows around us were becoming thicker and moving like living beings. In one of the books, I came across a mention of an ancient ritual performed by the monks of this monastery. This ritual was intended to summon dark forces, and its consequences were catastrophic. The monastery was cursed, and its inhabitants died under mysterious circumstances. Now I understood that we had not just found an abandoned building, but a place where a terrible tragedy had occurred. We continued to explore the underground and stumbled upon another door, locked with a heavy iron padlock. With great difficulty, we managed to break it open, and behind the door we found a small chamber. In the center of the chamber stood a sarcophagus covered in rusty chains. From it emanated a strange energy that made the hair on the back of our necks stand on end. Alexander suggested opening the sarcophagus to find out what was inside. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. When we removed the chains and opened the heavy lid, a thick fog enveloped us. Inside the sarcophagus, there was no body, only an ancient scroll emitting a faint light. We cautiously took the scroll and began to study it. It contained ancient spells and a description of a ritual that was supposed to summon something from another world. But the most horrifying part was at the end of the scroll. It mentioned that the ritual had been performed incorrectly, and instead of subjugating the darkness, the monks had unleashed it. We realized we were in danger. Something had awakened in this underground, and it began to pursue us. The shadows around us came to life, revealing the outlines of people who were once monks. Their faces were twisted in pain and horror, and their eyes glowed with a dead light. We rushed toward the exit, but the tunnels started to change as if something or someone wanted to confuse us. Every turn led us to a dead end, and the shadows drew closer. We heard their whispers penetrating our minds, making us lose our grip on reality. Finally, we found the path to the staircase and began to climb. The light from our flashlight started to fade, and the cold became more unbearable. We felt something invisible trying to hold us in this cursed place, but our resolve was stronger. When we emerged to the surface, the monastery was already shrouded in the darkness of night. We didn't look back and hurried to leave this place. But even when we descended into the village, I felt the shadows still following us. We swore never to return to that monastery or tell anyone what we had found there. Many years have passed since then, but I still feel the presence of something sinister when I'm alone in the dark. I know we awakened a force we should never have disturbed, and now that force will always be near, wherever I may be.